Great evening, everyone, and welcome once again to Conversations with, a recurrent web series organized by the Trinidad and Tobago chapter of the Internet Society and hosted by yours truly, Kevon Swift. I'll be assisted by our chair of the Internet Society, Niran Bihari, in co-moderation for this evening's activities. Hi, Niran. I know you can't see Niran, but I'm sure you'll be able to hear him throughout the course of this evening. As a quick housekeeping note, please feel free to ask your questions in the chat or at any time during the discussions, and we'll be sure to address them as best as we can. Also, if you'd like to make an intervention directly, please, with your mic, please use the raise hand function, and myself or Niran will acknowledge you and give you the virtual floor. For tonight's series, we have none other than specially invited guest Mr. Rishi Maharaj, the Executive Director of EquiGov. And we are going to address in very, very easy, ordinary, easy to follow terms, the entire deal around data protection and privacy, what these terms mean, where does Trinidad and Tobago find itself among data protection and privacy regimes across the world. We're going to delve into these issues. So without further ado, let's get straight into it. And I'd like to welcome you, Rishi. Great evening, and how are you doing?
Thanks very much, Kevon, and thank you very much to the Internet Society for inviting me for this very interesting and intriguing discussion tonight.
Wonderful, Rishi. We are very happy to have you here this evening. I think data protection and privacy are a lot of buzzwords we hear, but you, of course, are the expert. You've been involved in this for about how many years?
Wow, Kevon, we go back in this a very long time. I think I really got involved in it around 2008, 2009 at the then Ministry of Public Administration, Ministry of Information, when they started working on well, even before that, with the National Data Protection Policy that I think you'll be familiar with. So yeah, it's been a while since I've been actually looking at this whole idea of data protection.
Great. And just for the audience's awareness, what exactly does it mean to be CIPM certified?
Okay, so CIPM certified CIPM basically means you're Certified Information Privacy Manager. So it's a certification that is issued by the International Association of Privacy Professionals, IAPP. I kind of compare it to project management certification. You have the project management body of knowledge, and you go through a process of understanding exactly what project management is about. It's the same thing with CIPM. So it's a certification issued by the International Association of Privacy Professionals. It's one of many that they have, and this is the first one I've completed, and I hope to do a couple more before the end of the year.
Great. So thank you very much, Rishi. I think you are the ideal person to talk to us tonight about data protection and privacy, particularly as it pertains to Trinidad and Tobago and the wider Caribbean. And I assume that you have been doing a lot of this work through your current institute, the EquiGov Institute, correct?
Yes, I've built from my knowledge and exposure of working in government for over 12, 13 years, focusing on issues such as data protection, freedom of information, transparency, and governance. And since I left government and out on my own now, I've been like evangelizing and working with private sector and non-governmental organizations on understanding exactly what is data protection and how does it impact me, and what we need to do to really get ourselves properly aligned with data protection best practices.
Well, thank you so much for making the time for us, Rishi. And on that very note about data protection and privacy, what are the intricacies of data protection and privacy that the ordinary person may not be aware of? What do we need to know exactly about data protection and privacy, especially now that we're looking at these issues becoming more to the fore with all that's happening during the pandemic? Why is this so important?
Well, I normally put my marker of, I guess, people in the Caribbean or people in Trinidad get a little bit more interested in data protection And my marker is normally the Cambridge Analytica scandal with Facebook, because obviously Trinidad and Tobago was implicated somewhere or the other with regards to that whole issue of using personal data and manipulating personal data. So I think what people need to understand is that on a daily, day-to-day business, we provide certain levels of personal data in simple transactions. When we go to the bank, when we go to do insurance, when we go online to purchase product, we divulge certain levels of personal data. I think for general people, you need to have an understanding of exactly what kind of data am I given? Do I really need to give this data to get this product and service? And, can I trust? Can I always come at it from a level of trust in that you are providing a certain level of information? Some of it may be personal, some of it may be sensitive personal information that you normally would not give out to anybody. And you're giving this to institutions, to professionals, doctors, lawyers, whoever it may be on a daily basis. And you need to have a sense of trust that these people will use my data in a manner that I want it to be used and not abuse it in any way, form, or fashion.
And speaking about personal data and sensitive personal data, what do these terms exactly mean? And I'm going to jump ahead with a question I have in mind. Are your vaccination records, where do they fit along the scheme of data protection concepts?
Right. So normally in data protection best practice, they normally differentiate between certain levels of data. So there's personal data, and personal data means data like your normal stuff that you're familiar with: your name, your address, your contact information, your email address, gender. So those things will be personal information. It has also evolved to talk about things such as cookies, IP addresses, or anything that could be used and amalgamated to give a picture of you. So little tidbits of pieces of data here and there that by themselves mean nothing, but if aggregated together would give a complete picture of who Kevon Swift or who Rishi Maharaj is. And then there's sensitive personal data, which is a separate category of personal data, which would be data you normally would not share with individuals, or you hold more closer to your heart. In some legislations, stuff like sexual orientation, political party affiliations, health data or medical data, biometric data. So each laws are different, but generally, I mean, for your question with regards to vaccination, I think that could be termed as health information. We know these days some people may, because of their beliefs, because of whatever it may be, may not want you to know if they are vaccinated or not. It's not information they would willingly give up. So I think that may fall into the line of sensitive personal data. And then why it differentiates between the both is because when you're dealing with sensitive personal data, a lot more stringent controls are placed on organizations when dealing with sensitive personal data.
I fully understand, because really it's a question of the repercussions that could come from breaches of these types of data.
Yeah.
And when it comes to repercussions, I know, for instance, when we think about reputation, I think reputation that is damaged within a small society is harder to recoup than if it were in a large society. And I think those are some of the considerations that we need to keep in mind when we think about the categories of data and the classifications. And speaking about small societies and the like, I was wondering if you could give us an overview of global data protection regimes, and if you could also comment a bit about any cultural idiosyncrasies that shape our data protection and privacy culture here in Trinidad and Tobago.
All right. Well, I mean, I think data protection laws are nothing new. They've been around in the world for many years. I mean, going back to the late 1960s, early 1970s to the present, But I think the uptick in data protection laws really happened around the late 90s into the 2000s, where I guess with the onset of technology and the internet and the explosion of IoT, the Internet of Things, and now we have AI and all these different machine learnings and things, a lot of countries have begun to see the need to have proper legislation in place. I mean, there are different types of laws. There are some laws are what we call, comprehensive laws. So one of the gold standard laws that exists in the world right now. It's something called the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. That's the EU standards, EU regulation that governs data protection of EU national data in the EU, and that has become a gold standard throughout the world, where we've now seen other countries in the world, and if I bring it to the Americas, or our region, we've seen where other countries within our region have begun to either amend or make adjustments to or pass new laws that are aligned with the GDPR. So, for example, in the US, which doesn't have a federal law, we've seen several states take steps to pass their own data protection laws. One of the most famous ones, obviously, is California. We have next door to us here in Brazil. They had their data protection law in place before GDPR, but they've now realigned and we've modeled their law based on GDPR. And then even here in the Caribbean, most recently in Jamaica and in Barbados in 2019 and 2020, they passed similar data protection laws based on GDPR. And actually, Barbados, as of March 31st of this year, their law is now operational. So it's now enforced. So I think it's something new for the Caribbean. I think privacy and the whole question of data protection is something that I think it's not so much a personal human rights issue. It's now become a compliance issues for government. And I say that because I have seen, and this comes back from my days of working in government, where we have entered, both Trinidad and the region have entered into bilateral trade agreements with the EU, with Canada, for example. And a lot of these bilateral trade agreements have within them provisions for data protection, saying that if you want to do trade with us, you need to have similar types of legislation on your book. So I think what's pushing this regime of data protection laws throughout the Caribbean is more so because of trade and economic well-being in terms of the relationships with the EU and Canada, who are one of our major trading partners.
All right. So thank you so much for introducing GDPR to us. And I think, as you mentioned, GDPR is now seen as a gold standard for data protection. And one of the interesting features of the GDPR is it's the extraterritoriality that comes with it. That extraterritoriality, meaning that regardless of where the jurisdiction is, once the personal data of a European citizen is involved, there needs to be an adjustment to accommodate that. So my question is, for let's say long-standing data collectors across the region here in Trinidad and Tobago, does GDPR create a significant amount of administrative burden? And what has been the response to implementing GDPR? Have you seen, for instance, that there are double schemes, one for European citizens, one for non-European citizens, or do you see that companies are more likely to implement a data protection and a data governance scheme with GDPR in mind as a standard for all of their customers, regardless of where they come from?
I think what I've realized as of late, I think this has started to happen uptick post-COVID. I think COVID really started drove digitalization efforts and transformation efforts, especially in private sector organizations. I think with regards to COVID, companies began to see, especially the larger multinational or multi-regional companies within the region, those who have companies based in other countries, in other jurisdictions like the Dutch Caribbean, Jamaica, Barbados, and stuff like that, that they have begun to realize that, one, we are sitting on a treasure trove of data that is useful for us from an economic point of view. So we need to utilize that. But two, in utilizing that, we also need to be aware of the fact that changes are now happening globally that are slowly starting to come home. Like I said, Jamaica and Barbados, two examples of passing their laws with regards to personal data protection. And they've begun to slowly realize that we need to now amend the way that we treat with personal data, regardless of if it's Caribbean citizens or EU nationals, and adopt, I guess, policies, procedures, standards, codes of practice that regulate that. And more and more, they have begun to look at the GDPR as, I guess, the model, because that seems to be the gold standard. But I guess one thing I'd probably like to add too is we also have ISO standards that comment. Most ISO information security people will be aware of the ISO standard 27000 that deals with information security management systems. Well, late 2019, 2020, the ISO released a new substandard to that, which is the ISO 277001 standard. And that standard more or less deals with personal information management systems. So if you're introducing a new management system deals with personal data, that new standard is now a substandard of the ISO information security standard. When you look at it, it's more a codification or standardization of GDPR in the way that it's written and the way it's approached. I think that is also, I guess, slowly to guide organizations in adopting this new digital transformation.
Wonderful. So you mentioned a lot of these ISO standards, and of course these ISO standards would be incorporated into what would be our data protection privacy practices here in the Caribbean and Trinidad and Tobago in particular. So would it be safe to say that all of these constitute a corpus of just private ordering? Because we are aware that the DPA isn't fully implemented. But of course, the DPA refers to OECD principles, which should be maintained in how we treat with personal data. So is it really that there's a huge push coming from our private sector and other entities to set up what would be their data protection practices and how they were treated? I mean, they're inspired by GDPR, which has the utmost, let's say, attention or priority, and then I guess ISO standards, etc. Is it private ordering that's doing all this here in Trinidad and Tobago?
It's slowly starting to gain traction. I don't think it's reached that fully as far as yet. I think many organizations, I think it's fair to say many organizations in Trinidad, I wouldn't want to speak for others in the Caribbean, but from a Trinidadian perspective, we like to take the point of view, well, it's not law yet, so we really don't have to do it as yet.
So forget
right, exactly.
If we don't have to bother with
it,
we're not touching it.
But I always come at it from a level of trust, because I think slowly, and it's slowly happening, you slowly start to see questions being asked. I think consumers and citizens are slowly beginning to change the way they think about personal data and asking certain questions as to, well, why you want all of this. You go to supermarket and part of it, they say, we have a new membership program. And we look at the membership program form, you see they're asking for all kind of different data besides your next thing. We have a common saying here, they want everything, including my blood type. And the people now beginning to ask questions as to, but why you want all this data? What's the purpose for it? So I don't see it's a large uptick yet in our private sector. I think more so those that are globally or extra regionally focused in their operations have begun to make that change, but those that are still, embedded within the Trinidad jurisdiction alone haven't really seen, I guess, a need to really fully robustly begin to adopt these practices as yet.
All right, that's an interesting observation that you've had there. And I guess with time, I mean, you mentioned it just now. The pandemic means that we have a flurry of what would be either the implementation of strategic actions or pivot actions just to cope. But we do anticipate that we won't see a rollback of these things when the pandemic is over. So it's really about inculcating data protection and security within our practices from here on onwards. So it's interesting that you mentioned that I guess because there isn't an incentive or let's say a punishment, a sanction for not implementing particular things, we aren't seeing it. But as you mentioned, those with extra regional links, they tend to do that just as a question of legal prudence and ensuring that they are complying with the global standard and they are complying with other things. Yeah. speaking about global standards and the other things you mentioned, or we spoke a lot about GDPR, what are some of the other data protection regimes that are prominent in the world that are probably not as prominent or not as demanding as GDPR?
Well, I mean, there are several jurisdictions within the world that have begun to adopt or have adopted data protection standards. I mean, when we did our initial Data Protection Act way back in 2011, or even during the preliminary stages, as you mentioned earlier, we would have looked at the OECD guidelines. We would have been guided by, because, you know, when we do laws in Trinidad and Tobago, we like to look at the big four, which is Australia, Canada, New Zealand, England, what they've done, and then model based on that. And I think, you know, slowly changes have begun to be made. I know Canada, for example, is now looking at reviewing their federal data protection, or PIPEDA, that's what they call it, the Personal Information Protection Act in Canada. But there are also different regimes throughout the world. So, for example, in Asia, ASEAN has their own standards with regards to data protection. More so, not only dealing with data protection within, you know, companies or within countries within the region, but also, I think this is the biggest thing that's happening in the world right now. The whole question of trans-global movement of data throughout the world, because that is now becoming, it's a billion-dollar industry with a lot of cloud service providers and other players in the market, you know, people offering software as a service and platforms as services. You know, there's a lot of data that is now being moved across the globe electronically. And because of that, we've seen regimes set up, you know, guidelines and practices that will govern the way. So ASEAN has their own framework for movement and transfer of data. Obviously, the EU is governed by GDPR. India, for example, is now relooking their own data protection laws. And they're also having questions with regards to the big internet service providers, you know, what they provide and what kind of information they provide out there. South Africa just implemented their new laws on personal data protection, freedom of information. Panama, which is a close neighbor of ours here, they passed their laws in 2019 and had a two-year implementation period, and that two-year implementation period ended, I think, in March of this year. So they now have data protection laws. Of course, we trade a lot with Panama. So, and of course, the US also has not a federal law, but to trade with the US and the EU, they had something called Privacy Shield, which was an agreement between the EU and the US to allow for transnational movement of data between the borders of the US and the EU. But that is now up in the air because the EU court ruled last year, I think in July, a famous case in the data protection realm called Schrems 2, in which someone took Facebook to court in the EU, saying that, you know, you violated my right by sending my data to the US, and the US doesn't have comparable legislation, or there's legislation in the US that allows the government to take my data when they want to without me having any rights.
Right.
It went all the way to the European Court, and the European Court last year ruled that the Privacy Shield agreement between the EU and the US was invalid, that it no longer held water. So now we're having debates even in EU countries as to, can I share data, EU national data, with the US jurisdictions? You know, how is that going to work? And then obviously now we have with Brexit, the UK is now no longer part of the EU. They have their own data protection laws. I think just last month they got an adequacy decision from the EU, but they're also looking to review their data protection laws. So, I mean, every week or every time I open my emails every now and then, and I subscribe to all these bulletins and stuff like that, there's always something new happening worldwide with regards to data protection. So it's not a set in stone concept. I think that's probably what I would like to relay. It's a very fluid concept because things are changing. It's tied up in politics. It's tied up in human rights. It's tied up in economic trade. It's tied up in, you know, in the trade of goods and services. So it's a very fluid thing that is ever evolving and ever changing.
All right. Thank Rishi. You actually answered a lot of the doubts and a lot of questions I had in my head. Before I continue my other question, I just wanted to remind the audience, feel free to place your comments or your questions at any time in the chat. And if you have a question, if you would like to take the virtual floor, let us know, and we'll give you the access to make your intervention when appropriate. So I'm going back to this Shrimps 2 case that you mentioned, which of course sets a precedent for what can or cannot be done by social media. Because for me, I think what a lot of people tend to assume or understand is that with social media, your personal data is traded somewhat as a commodity. And that is really, I mean, there's no such thing as a free lunch. So something that's quote unquote free service actually has a price.
If it's free, you're the product. So
exactly, exactly. But what you seem to indicate right now is that a lot of that is changing. So even for our social media companies based in the US, because of pressures coming from other areas, that approach, you would say it's somewhat changing. Could we expect to see updates of terms and conditions for users on these social media platforms, which tend to be quite global?
Well, I mean, let's take an example. I mean, just last year, I think it was last year, we had the issue with, late last year until late this year, we had the issue with WhatsApp. But WhatsApp is owned by Facebook. And there was a big question about WhatsApp and their revised privacy policy or privacy statement that people had to accept, and that created a whole bunch of red flags with regards to, because WhatsApp is part of Facebook, because Facebook owns WhatsApp, so it's part of the Facebook ecosystem. And WhatsApp is now amending their privacy statement to let you know that, listen, WhatsApp, because you're part of Facebook, we're not going to be sharing your data with Facebook. That created all sorts of issues worldwide. Many regulators in the EU began to question and ask questions about, why, what, you can't do this. I think in India also the government kicked back, and that forced WhatsApp, I think, to postpone or put a pause on the implementation of that privacy policy. So I think globally, you're beginning to see, I saw someone ask a question there with the whole idea of antitrust and protection. I think that's what we're now starting to see slowly happening worldwide, especially in the US now with a new, I know Biden just had a new FTC chair, and she's very strong on breaking up these monopolies of social media giants. So it's like I say, it's an ever fluid concept that's happening, and we're starting to see questions being asked as the dominance of what the term we use is FANGs. So FANG represents, that's a term they use in the data protection landscape. FANG is Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Alphabet, which is Google, Netflix, and I can't remember the other one. But that's, that's the FANG. If you think about FANG, vampire that injects you and just sucks your blood. So that's the term that we use right now. They use for these guys.
Right. I mean, that's a very interesting point that was made by Christian Apu, and you started to answer that. The whole antitrust, anti-competitiveness, that is really at the fore right now. I mean, just this week, France fined Google $600 million. I mean, that's a crazy amount for what they consider to be anti-competitive behavior. So you are seeing a lot of states are paying a lot of attention to these things. And of course, the fans are the ones who are the big players with all that pertains to personal data and the like. We have another question here from John Braffett. He asked, where are we here in Trinidad and Tobago in terms of our data privacy legislation?
That's a good question, John. Well, I mean, as we know, in 2011, we passed our Data Protection Act. And of course, that act was based on the OECD guidelines and best practice at the time. Our act in 2011 predates GDPR and all the other things that have happened since then. The act, however, was never fully implemented. It was proclaimed in part. I think the provisions that were proclaimed were the general principles, which are the first part, and the section 6, which are the general principles, and then the parts of the act that gave legal prevalence to the appointment of the information commissioner. I think our thinking at the time, and I say our because I was part of government when that happened. I helped in the final drafting and the passage of our act at the time, was to appoint the information commissioner and allow that expert to be able to guide the final implementations of the act. But it was never fully implemented. And since then, obviously, it's now close to 11 years and 10 years since that has happened. The world has evolved and legislation has evolved with regards to data protection. And as far as I remember now, the government, I think the AG would have noted this late last year in several sessions he would have spoken at, that the government is now looking at reviewing. I know they've hired a consultant on board to review our data protection and I think electronic transaction legislation, because they both went hand in hand at the time when we did data protection, because data protection, electronic transactions kind of went hand in hand. So there's a consultant on board right now who's reviewing both legislations with a view to, I guess, bring them up to date where the world has gone since then. And I know the consultant had several stakeholder sessions with both private and public sector, looking at GDPR obviously as the benchmark and seeing what can be done. So as it stands now, we have an act that's law, not fully implemented, and the government is currently reviewing it. As to the timelines, I really wish I knew the answer to that.
That's an interesting point, Rishi. I think that explains why now we have this sort of hodgepodge of practices, because that is truncated where it is. Then we have, as we stated, the companies with extra regional links. They tend to implement the gold standards and the best practices. And then there's a gap between that and then our local TNT jurisdiction only companies that wouldn't necessarily reach to that point unless it becomes something that has binding power and, of course, sanctions attached to it. So it's a huge hodgepodge of practices that we have right now in TNT when it comes to data protection and privacy. Is that a fair statement to make?
Yeah, that's fair to say. I think we've seen, companies have taken several approaches. Some have taken the approach of, especially if you have, regional companies or regional branches or subsidiaries, that listen, you know what, we're going to adopt the best practice as it is, and because that's the highest standard. So we're going to go for the highest standard and practice that throughout the organizations in whichever jurisdictions we are in. And then there are others that are taking a more jurisdictional approach. So if, for example, Barbados and Jamaica have their laws, or laws are coming on soon, they're going to adopt practices based on those standards. Whereas because Trinidad, we aren't there as yet, we're probably going to have something slightly different for Trinidad as opposed to other parts of the region. So I guess, each company's, I guess, based on their own business analysis of what they see is important, are adopting different approaches to it.
Okay, thanks. Again, any questions that you have, feel free to answer them at any time. I think Rishi is really delving into some very, very interesting details here for us to know here in Trinidad and Tobago. And one of them is that you mentioned that the DP bill, or data protection law, and electronic transactions law were piloted together in Trinidad and Tobago, probably out of convenience or the like. What would you say are the other intersections with data protection law? Because I'm thinking off the bat, when it comes to security and cybersecurity, you're securing something, and that something tends to be data. So what do you see in practice, or what would you say are the main points that we need to take into account with what I call linkages and intersections with data protection law?
Yeah, I think, I always tell people that data protection and information security are like brothers and sisters. They work together, they go hand in hand. Each obviously has their own, because obviously for those who information security would know, information security is more concerned with, the CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability of data. And data protection touches on those things, but then other things such as the rights and obligations of data subjects, or your customers, your employees, and stuff like that, and questions of compliance and legality. But there is an inextricable link between the two. When you really look at GDPR or other types of data protection laws, and you really examine the thinking behind it now going forward, many of these laws are now looking at it from a risk-based approach. When I mean risk-based approach is basically, as in anyone doing business, there's a risk in anything that you deal with in the business, especially those that are dealing with a business that, deal with the collection of and use of or sharing of personal data. Because now a lot of data is now no longer being stored. Well, a lot of data, first of all, is now being collected electronically via websites, via mobile apps, or via other online interfaces. So a lot of information is now being collected electronically and being used electronically or being stored electronically, on the clouds or on servers and stuff like that, as opposed to, back in the days, hard copy paper and stuff like that. So because it's now collected electronically, obviously there are now risks involved in that we've seen recently. I mean, the data shows it worldwide that during COVID, there has been a worldwide uptick in cybersecurity attacks, ransomware attacks. In the Caribbean, we have not been immune to that. I think just last year we had several warnings being issued by our own Trinidad CIT. And, we saw where certain companies were attacked with ransomwares. So obviously that is a risk. So where data protection and information security match is that, first of all, you need to have an understanding of what kind of data do you collect. A proper data inventory. What kind of data you collect? How does that data flow through your organization? So what are the touch points of this thing within your organization? What systems is it interacting with? And then once you have a complete holistic understanding of how the data flows through your organization, then that's where the link with information security comes in. So now we can begin to see, now, do we have proper security controls to be able to manage this data? Is it encrypted from the time we've gotten it? Do we have access controls so we can control who has access to it, who doesn't? If the data is being moved extra jurisdictionally between country and country or between one company in Port of Spain and next company in San Fernando, is the data, first of all, does the data need to be moved? Do they need to have access to it? And then, do we have proper encryption of the data during transport at rest? If we're using third-party vendors, a lot of data protection laws now, and GDPR is now strong on it, because GDPR now places further obligations on data controllers, or to make it in simple terms, your company. So company A wants we collect data, that's our business, but we can't process it. So we have, by processing, I mean store it, use it, whatever. It's very holistic. So we engage a cloud service provider locally or internationally to be able to store data on the cloud, because it's easier for us, it's cheaper for us. I mean, a lot of these things are now easier and cheaper than having your own server and everything on site and everything. Data protection laws now are placing obligations on company A, which is the host company, to do what we call due diligence checks on your third-party vendors. Are they compliant? Do they have proper policies? Do they have proper systems? Are they certified? Do they have, SOC 1, SOC 2 certification? If they're using credit card, if you're using them to interface payment platforms, are they PCI compliant? All these things are there. So that's where there's a link. There's that, like I said, inextricable link between data protection and information security, and that they both work hand in hand. They're not separate. So you need to have your compliance, data protection team, and information security team working together hand in hand. So they need to be on the same page at all times and not separate in dealing with these issues.
Okay, great. I see John has made a follow-up question, and he asks, any chance of a regional front or data protection response? It is not inconceivable to see CARICOM collating information across the region to draft policy. How do we bridge disparate data privacy standards? And Rishi, before you answer that, that question just brought back memories of a project here in the region called HIPCA, which
yes.
sought to actually bring together somewhat regional standards in terms of policy guidelines and draft or model legislative text. But let me give you your time to reflect on that question about a regional response.
I know this is a question that has come up a lot recently. I think as of 2019 was it, the TTMAG, when they had their normal sessions, they had a session dedicated to, is it time for the region to have what we call a CDPR, a Caribbean Data Protection Regulation? And and like as you mentioned, we both participated way back in the days with HIPCA, and I think that was trying to have a harmonized approach to certain key legislations throughout the regions, of which the three main ones I remember was electronic transactions, data protection, freedom of information. Uh, I think it's something worthwhile. Honestly, though, I think we are not at the stage of the EU or even ASEAN in terms of, I think CARICOM still has its own issues to work on. This is just my personal point of view. So my disclaimer is that this is Rishi Maharaj's views and not the views of the Information Society or the government of Trinidad and Tobago. But I think CARICOM has its own issues to deal with. It doesn't have a good track record regionally of having this regional approach to different things, because obviously each country still has their own sovereign ways of doing things. So I think it's a laudable idea. I think it's a conversation we need to have, and I say so because when you look at the EU, for example, and what they've done with regards to data protection laws, it's driven mainly because I think of their history. And the history of many EU countries is that of dictatorship, autocratic governments spying on them. Each country in the EU had, for one stage of their life, a dictatorship. Spain, Germany, Poland, other parts of the EU, and so because at least to be able to deal with that, as well as the other things that are coming up with information technology, they have begun to adopt stringent laws to manage that. And Germany, for example, because of their history, has one of the most strictest, I think, data protection regimes in the EU.
Correct.
So they are governed by a history. Same thing with Latin America, which has their own data protection laws, again governed by a history of autocratic dictatorships and human rights issues. ASEAN is moved because of economic, their economic powerhouse, Singapore, Japan, China, South Korea, and the whole idea of transporting data now become an economic thing for them. So they are now driven by that. I think CARICOM, we need to figure out in CARICOM, what does data protection mean for us? What does data privacy mean for us? I think we've slowly begun to have that discussion at different country levels. And very quickly, I will cite the example of Jamaica, where the government in Jamaica tried to implement a national ID system in 2017, 2018, I think it was, for have people collecting a lot of personal data on people for a national ID database. That was challenged in the court, and went all the way up to the Court of Appeal in Jamaica, and the Court of Appeal, in striking down the government's approach, looked a lot on the whole idea of data protection, data privacy, and information technology. So it was really focused on data protection, privacy issues, and technology, and the use of technology to do these things. I think that's the first case I've seen in the Commonwealth Caribbean, that touches on the whole idea of privacy as a human right and a human issue. So I think we need to now have that discussion within the region. What does data protection mean for us? And then based on that, what laws do we have in place? I've never been a proponent of one cap fits all. Yes, GDPR is the gold standard. We know that. We no longer know, but it doesn't mean that we need to adopt GDPR cut and paste. We need to think of, what does it mean for us? What are the benefits in it for us as countries in the region? And then using, I guess, GDPR as your baseline, design a law or laws that, are aligned with it, but are also unique to what our own situation is.
So thank you for mentioning that, because I think quite often we tend to not see that the current state of data protection or privacy laws in various regions, and in particular in Europe, they were conditioned by historic and cultural incidents. So in the case of, so GDPR, yes, but you specifically spoke about Germany having one of the strongest DP regimes. And any historian could tell you that's because of the Nuremberg laws, when those Nuremberg laws allowed for a lot of atrocities in history against particular people. So it's interesting to understand that there were specific cultural and historic contexts. And I think it's really now the time for us in the Caribbean to understand what are our contexts, what are our imperatives and priorities in coming up with the concept of a Caribbean data protection regime. And I think that's very important. I mean, another huge difference between CARICOM and the EU, for instance, is that we had a high level of ingenuity with this sort of light approach, intergovernmental collaboration on a number of fronts. And I think we were quite unique in that sense, because in the world, no other grouping was doing that sort of thing. But now groupings have gone past that. You get full supranational force with something like GDPR or any other directive coming out of the EU. And we are still trying to figure out how to collaborate, yet maintain our singular interests. And it still seems as if it's a give and take that occurs. But I think because of the pandemic, because of this great equalizer, quote unquote, a lot of coming together and synchronizing will occur by default when we think about how we continue to weather the storm right now, and what would be the economic recovery of the region post COVID-19. So I really
I think
that
so.
you raised there. I see Chris Chinapu has made a question here. He asked, in terms of protection, what measures for sharing data collected with law enforcement? And I'm quite excited about that, the intersections between data and then law enforcement and the ecosystem there. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what we've seen, at least in other countries, and I guess I'll use GDPR because I mean that's the standard, in that there's normal a falsity that you need to have consent only to process data or to collect and use data, and that's a misnomer. In that when you look at GDPR, and both Jamaica and Barbados has similar language in their legislation, consent is but one thing you need to be able to process data or to collect and use data. The others, I mean, and they're numerous, I wouldn't go into all of them, but some of the other things that you can use as a legal basis to be able to collect and process data is if you're going to enter into a contract with somebody or you have a contractual relation with somebody. And to address Mr. Chinapu's question, the whole idea, if you have legal obligations, so if you have a law that you have to comply with, and I'll give you a good example. A good one, I guess, would be anti-money laundering laws and stuff like that, where you need to collect certain amount of data because of a law enforcement, and you need to share that data with law enforcement. Then there are provisions with regards to that, or with regards to other activities where you may be subjected to the orders of a court, or to assist in legal obligations to be able to deal with criminal convictions or criminal investigations ongoing. Then there are provisions within GDPR, and even I think within Jamaica and Barbados' law, that allows for that I guess you would say sharing of data or of information, but it must be specific. So it has to be for specific. It's not an open door to share everything. You need to be specific in what data. So for example, let's say the police comes at your door, an organization, and say, listen, we need to get X, Y, and Z data. Then there needs to be a specific reason for getting it. There needs to be a specific, I guess, justification or legal instrument to be able to give that data. So in that case, you probably have to come with a warrant or some kind of judicial instrument that's saying, listen, we went to court and we have followed due process. So it's not like the police can come knock on your door. And then there's also the question of the powers of the regulator. And this is what we've seen several kickbacks in some countries where they feel that the regulator, even in our law, when we passed our law, that the regulator had too much powers. And they had too much powers to be able to come and, like, I think one member of parliament said, to knock down your door and take anything they want. So I think that's where you need to, to temper, if I can use that word, the what data protection is about, and the powers that law enforcement would have or could have with your normal jurisdiction, your normal due process of law, and that should never supersede anything with regards to the personal data that the organization collects.
All right, thanks so much for the explanation, Rishi. And of course, time flies when you're having fun. We are coming up to our home stretch, the last 10 minutes of this evening's session. So of course, any other questions or comments that you'd like to make, please put them right now in the chat, because we'll close that off in a very short while. So Rishi, going back to the point you made about the state of affairs here in Trinidad and Tobago and the Information Commissioner's Office, and now we were just talking about the intersections between, let's say, the data collectors and what needs to occur with law enforcement, of course, any transfer occurring under judicial order. Could you just give us a panorama of how data governance works? So let's say we have a fully implemented, a fully operational data commissioner or information commissioner. What would be the remit and the responsibilities of that office? What would be the intersections between that office and law enforcement in the case of a cyber attack? Because a cyber attack is not only a question of the attack to an information system. I think for the most part, when you look at cyber attacks, one of the key issues that raises a flag is the robbery of data in itself, which has a huge value attached to it, and therefore there'll be varying layers of considerations at play here. You're looking at cybercrime legislation, data protection, and the like. So could you just illustrate for us a bit that panorama of the ideal data governance scenario you would like to see here in Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, I think we need, well, first of all, I think we need to have one of the most key responsibilities of any regulator that you establish would be obviously education and training, in terms of educating organizations as to their roles, responsibilities, what they need to be aware of, what they need to do. That will be, I guess, the first point of call. Because once you implement a new legislation like this, there is going to need to be some buy-in time to get things up and running. Most legislations have like a 2-year lag time between implementation and full implementation and operationalization. So there needs to be that training.
And sorry to interrupt you there, but could I say that as a non-state actor at EquiGov, that you actually conduct some of these sensitization and training activities, correct?
That's correct, yeah. So we do training and sensitization on data protection and what you need to do to build out a data protection program. But then you asked an interesting question there with regards to breaches and cybersecurity incidents and what happens. And again, I'll lean on examples of GDPR and Jamaica and Barbados's law. And what I would like to happen here in Trinidad is that when you look at GDPR and data protection laws in Barbados and Jamaica, for example, they have within them provisions now that state that once a data breach occurs within an organization, and it is of a certain high level of risk. Actually, Barbados and GDPR more or less says, once you have a data breach, and data breach is of such a high risk that it's the kind of data that has been stolen or hacked, the amount of people's information that has been stolen or hacked, you have to report that to the commissioner within 72 hours.
Oh.
Which means that if you have a vendor or a cloud service provider who probably they've been hacked and they're working on your behalf, they need to notify you within a shorter period of time so that you can notify within 72 hours. Jamaica law basically says once you have a breach, regardless of risk level, at least how it is now, you have to alert the commissioner within 72 hours of the breach, what has happened, what you've done or what you've begun to do to be able to address the breach. And we have instances in the EU where a lot of companies have now begun to be fined. And let me draw a good example of the Cayman Islands. I just recently had a session with a lawyer from the Cayman Islands in a PrivSec regional discussion on information security and data protection. And the Cayman Islands actually has data protection laws. They have a regulator. And of late, he said one of the biggest things that they've been dealing with is the whole idea of breaches and the reporting of breaches to the commissioner. So I think that's one thing that I think we need to address. And that's where it now intersects with cybersecurity, because that's where you now have to, within an organization, you need to have proper data breach procedures for reporting the incident within the organization. Okay, you mentioned from a governance point of view. So you need to have proper procedures to be able to report the incident, to be able to investigate the incident, to determine, what kind of breach is it? Is it a personal data breach? Is it a cybersecurity breach? Because remember, a breach is a very holistic term. It could even mean you sending the wrong email to somebody else and not to my address. That's considered a breach because you're exposing personal information to somebody else and not me. But if it now becomes a cybersecurity breach, that's where the intersect of your cybersecurity team within the organization, the cybersecurity law, and data protection will now intersect in terms of how you treat with, investigate, and deal with these things. Because, and just to backtrack very quickly a bit, when we talked about information security and intersection between that and data protection, it has now begun to force organizations to think of these things in a different light. In that normally when organizations think about risk or think about information security, they think about it from an internal point of view. What's the risk to me as an organization? What do I need to do to put in place to protect myself? What information security do I need to put in place to protect myself? But data protection laws now forces you to think of your customer first. Think of your client, your customer, your employee. What's the risk to them if this information goes out there? We mentioned earlier in the session, personal information, sensitive personal information, sexual orientation, ethnicity. There are certain types of information that if it goes out there or exposed, could, organization could simply pay a fine. That's easy for them to do. But the reputational harm or the other kinds of harm it could have on normal citizens if their data goes out there far exceeds the problems you could have in an organization. So that's where, again, data protection law is now forcing organizations to think externally as opposed to internally. What's the risk to my customer? What's the risk to my employee if this data goes out there? So that's where I guess cybersecurity, information security, and data protection all link one way or the other.
All right. Thank you so much, Rishi. I think we're coming up to probably our very last question. With the examples that you just gave between data protection regimes between Barbados and Jamaica, I think one of the key or the clear differences there is the whole question of mens rea or the criminal intention. Because you said that it's somewhat prorated or it's in a scheme within Barbados, within Jamaica, not so much. So I think the Jamaican context means that even for mistakes, there could be some serious penalties and sanctions attached to that.
Okay, but I think when the regulator does eventually come on board, there may be some, because again, these things have regulations that come with them. So I think the regulations may, spell it out a little bit more.
And understand exactly what are the policy contexts. So therefore, it would be in tune or in tandem with what happens on the ground. And with that, given our society here in Trinidad and Tobago, how we view personal responsibility and all these other sorts of considerations, would implementing a proper data protection regime as an up-and-coming e-business and a small e-business as that, do you think that data protection regimes can actually be disincentives or incentives for attracting more global business? What are your views on that?
Research has been done, and this is not me talking, this is research has been done by Cisco, for example, in 2019, 2020, that has shown in other jurisdictions in the US and especially in the US, that companies that adopt data protection programs in place or spend money on data protection program in place, for every dollar you spend, you get back at least $2 or $3 in return. So there has been evidence to show that the adoption of proper data protection policies and practices and procedures are beneficial. I think for our country, as we're looking at post-COVID and the economic recovery coming forward, I think driving e-commerce and driving Trinidad and Tobago as a hub to do cloud service and all these different things, I think having a proper regime in place that shows we are updating standards with other parts of the world would be of a benefit from us from both a macro perspective and then from a micro perspective, it is beneficial to businesses.
All right. So for the companies that do not have that sort of extra jurisdictional reach, it is a good thing. I mean, it's a good investment. It goes hand in hand. Prudence and good security practices go hand in hand with good data protection practices, which will lead to more dollars or more return on your investment in the long run, correct?
Yeah, think of yourself as the customer. I mean, it's all, again, I always come at it bottom line from trust. would I trust doing business with a company, or would you as a company, a person who owns a company, would you trust doing business with a company that doesn't handle your data properly? Possibly not. Then, people should trust you in terms of the way you treat with their personal data. So it goes, like the old saying, one hand don't clap. We all need to work together.
Right. And again, I mean, all of this is very relevant between the mixed match of what you would call strategic digital transformation and pivoting, because for those who are pivoting, they really need to understand that the trust and confidence factor is really there at play, and you're no longer looking at a very limited playing field or market by virtue of being online, being digital. The potential for your business to grow and the sort of different considerations you need to have in mind, they are a lot more wider than just thinking of running a mom and pop shop in a sort of traditional brick and mortar sense.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so Rishi, we have come to that time where I would say, quite unfortunately, things.
We have one question from Carol Douglas, so I'm going to let him speak for a moment.
Oh, wonderful! Hi, Carol. Yes, let's hear Carol's intervention.
Unmute. Good afternoon, everybody. Good night.
Good night.
Are you hearing me?
Yes, we are.
Kevon, you're doing a fantastic job, and compliments to ISOC.LIVE for a brilliant session here. And Rishi, well, he's a wealth of information. I really do appreciate all the information and the knowledge that he's sharing here tonight. Is really, really fantastic. I really was going to type my question in, but somehow I wasn't able to access the function. So, but it's really just to say in a nutshell that I'm not say we, I'm not speaking from TAD, but I'm just speaking from the general perspective of someone who's encountered some of the issues that we have realized that there's a long way to go when it comes to data protection. And yes, some people are quite cognizant of it, but at the same time, there seems to be a lot of people who seem to be totally either unaware or not bothered about data that is collected. Even when you sign up for an app, they're just happy to get the app because, the priority is really to get access to whatever enjoyment. And so that is just one issue. But the other issues is even from the legal perspective, that what has to be done is that you have to build out the same thing that Rishi said, the ecosystem, that you have to have lawyers, you have to have judges who are well trained, the enforcement procedures, that's magistrates if it is that you have to go to the summary court. So there's so many different components or moving parts, as people say, that have to come together so that we'll have a successful data protection regime. So the law is only one step, but yes, as Rishi said, there's a public education aspect of it. Or you might have said that, Kevon, and there's also, like I said, these other aspects where you have to have people properly trained. And then, like I said, I mean, it seems that there is a learning curve for some people as to, well, how important do you consider your data important? How important do you think it is, and so forth. But I know time is upon us, and so I just want to thank you all again for a fantastic discussion, and I'll be listening from the side. Have a good one. Take care.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Carol. It's always a joy and a pleasure to hear from you, and of course, your insights and your very deep knowledge on digital issues here in Trinidad and Tobago. Rishi, I don't know if you have any reactions to some of Carol's comments, to probably reiterate some of the messages you'd given before, or introduce something else.
I agree with you. I mean, data protection, you would know this well, from our days in public admin. It's one thing to pass a law, but after you've passed the law, that's when the work really begins. It takes time to build a culture, to build a understanding, and to build out, like you said, the ecosystem of what needs to get done. Businesses need to be attuned as to what needs to happen. People need to be trained up or have knowledge as to how do I know, how does this affect me? What do I need to now put in place? I mean, even from a government perspective, how do I balance it with other obligations such as freedom of information, and I have to give out information from FOIs and stuff like that. So passing a data protection law in the morning is, I mean, it may be difficult, but that's the easy step. The hard step is really now, how do we now change a culture and a mindset to be able to begin to practice what we preach? And that takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. It's an evolution. And like I said, it's a very fluid concept and a fluid thing that's happening worldwide. And you know, if I had to end with one point, I think at the end of the day, I think data protection is important because of what we see happening. And we always say technology is always 5 years ahead of laws. So even if you pass laws now, technology within 2-3 years will make those laws outdated. So it's always a catch-up game. But you know, at the end of the day, we need to be mindful of what we do, how we interact out there, and what kind of information we put out there in the public domain.
Okay, thanks so very much, Rishi. And of course, I've said this in previous conversations with series. The good thing about the pandemic, because you know, a lot of times we don't think about these things, about the good thing. But I think we are quickly running out of plausible alternatives when it comes to setting up data protection regimes here in this country. I mean, data protection and e-trans here in TNT, they have been in the sphere of decision makers since 2001. And now 20 years after, we know that there's no longer a question of if and when, but it has to happen. It's our duty. I mean, we are in a situation where things will never be the same again. And I would say that it's quite fortunate that we have had a huge uptick with internet services and digital transformation issues, but we should also expect that all of the attendant issues with that, the attendant risks and, well, not only risk, but opportunities and risk will actually come to the fore, and we need to be able to deal with that. So thank you so much, Rishi, for sharing the wealth of information that you've shared with us. I am pretty certain a lot of people will be interested in finding out more about what you do in your day-to-day. So where exactly can we get what are the details for the EquiGov Institute? How can we interact with you further?
Right. I mean, I'm on LinkedIn most of the time. That's my social media platform of choice. So just search for Rishi Maharaj, and I should come up there. EquiGov, we have a website, not www, but EquiGov, EquiGov.com. So it's EquiGov.com. You can also email me at Rishi, RISHI, @EquiGov.com. And yeah, I'm always happy to discuss anything or to help along the whole idea of data protection, transparency, governance. You know, that's what we really focus on.
Okay, thanks so very much, Rishi. So thank you from my heart for myself personally, and on behalf of Internet Society Trinidad and Tobago, and for all of our audience members here, whether they're participating directly right now in the call or they're going to follow up with the recording of this session. It will be available on the Internet Society Trinidad and Tobago's Facebook page and other channels. I'd like to thank you tremendously, and I wish all of you a great and wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you very much.